miracles. We're going to skip a great deal of what's in here. It concerns determinism and objections to the possibility of miracles in themselves, which is, from Kant and from others. I mean, the probability of your coming over a convinced or coming into contact with a convinced determinist, I think, is pretty low as far as people to whom you would explain the faith. But you would not want to know where it is if ever you needed to know. And I would suggest that you do obtain these books for your own personal library. They're expensive, but you will. You might have to look for arguments that people give to you during the course of your lives, your priestly lives. And you should know where they are. It's one thing to take the course. It's another thing to know where to look for something, because when you take the course, you know where to look for something. You see, I have to look up. I, of course, took moral theology. I taught moral theology. But many times you have to go back to moral theology and look it up just to make sure that you're right about it, you see. So that's why it's good to have at least some things in your personal library, and also if there's a rectory or something like that, there should be also a common library where you might have more stuff, So that's something. But I would suggest that you have these books in your possession. Because he answers everything, and sometimes you never know who you're going to get. So, the nominal definition is clear from the etymology. So, miracle is from admiratione, so it's miraculum, your wonder, and what happened. Now this arises when an effect is made manifest while its cause remains hidden, as when a man sees an eclipse without knowing its cause. See, so people that did not know the cause of the eclipse thought it was miraculous. That's how St. John the Brebeuf saved his life, because he predicted the eclipse of the moon or the sun, one or the other. Because even at that time they were able to predict them. And the Indians were just, how could you do that? Because of course they didn't know why that happened. So they thought he was, somebody special as a result of that. So they decided to keep him around. But it's in that biography. So sometimes things are considered miraculous because we don't know what the causes are. Now, the cause of an effect may be known by one person while remaining unknown to others, what I just said. And something is wonderful to one man, but not to others. Let's see, as an eclipse is to a country farmer, but not to an astronomer. Now, the term miracle is used because something is, as it were, full of wonder, namely as having the cause completely hidden from all. However, this cause is God. Therefore, we use the term miracles for whatever God does outside the order of causes which we know. So everything has to have a sufficient cause. There is nothing that happens in the universe without a sufficient cause. So it's either some natural cause or some supernatural cause. So St. Thomas defines it there in the second paragraph on page 48. Therefore, properly speaking, the term miracle is to be applied to those things which are done in a divine manner outside of the commonly observed order of things. So the Catholic, to skip down to the Catholic notion of miracles, the First Vatican Council. However, in order that the obedience of our faith be nevertheless in harmony with reason, God willed that exterior proofs of his revelation, namely, you know what V-I-Z, it's French, vise, that means namely in French, means pay attention to, divine facts especially miracles and prophecies, should be joined to the interior helps of the Holy Ghost, as they manifestly display the omnipotence and infinite knowledge of God. They are most certain signs of divine revelation adapted to the intelligence of all men. So this is why our blessed Lord performed many miracles, and the apostles in the early church and various holy men in the early church perform miracles. According to the Council, miracles are divine facts manifestly displaying God's omnipotence. Therefore, according to the Church, miracles, properly so called, must be above the powers of the whole of created and creatable nature, even above those of angels. See, an angel can do something that appears to be miraculous, but is not in fact miraculous. He can do something very quickly, for example, and to in such a way that you are deceived by what you're, by sight. In other words, you think that it is something miraculous, when in fact it's just something that is within his own powers, and his powers are formidable. For example, he can lift something up, a great deal. That's one of the signs of possession, is that people can lift things that are incapable. They can lift a whole table or something like that, or something very heavy that no ordinary person could lift. And you see, that's a sign of possession, because the devil could do that. See, but he can't perform, or no angel can perform, a true miracle. Thus, they essentially differ from extraordinary natural facts, as well as from demonic wonders, which are mere simulacra, imitations of miracles. They also are distinct from ordinary divine facts, like God's daily creation of spiritual souls. See, so in the generation of a human being, the parents provide the matter, God provides the soul. See, so unlike animals where the soul is dependent on the matter, so there is no need for divine intervention, but there is a need for divine intervention to produce a rational soul, with an intellect and will. See, so that's not strictly speaking a miracle. That is simply a divine intervention, or a divine causality. Nonetheless, externally manifested prophecy can be reduced to the category of miracles. That is, to God's miraculous intervention in the world, either in the physical order or in the intellectual moral order. See, so you could not do a prophecy naturally, unless, let me take that back. In other words, you could predict something that is probable from natural causes. That one day Mount Shasta is going to blow its top. It's a big volcano in California. It probably will, maybe 10,000 years from now, but or some natural thing that is giving signals of some activity, such as earthquakes or war, for example, that predictions of war. Those kind of predictions are based on nature, and are, yes, but they're not apodictic. In other words, that they may or may not take place. Like climate change, we're supposed to be all burned up by now. I don't know if you know that. Al Gore, back in the 10, 12 years ago, by 2025, this planet is just going to be a wasteland, and we're going to be all burned up. Look outside, we're not burned yet. I mean, so that's of course ridiculous. But and in the 1970s, they were saying we were going to go through an ice age in the 2000s. Yeah. Everything's going to be frozen. That's more like it seems. But anyway, So heterodox notion of miracles, as we said earlier in this work, there are two principal heterodox notions of miracles. According to the first, which proceeds from a determinism, a miracle is an extraordinary natural fact that has not yet been explained scientifically. This is very typical of atheists and agnostics. Just science hasn't caught up to it yet. Something that religious sentiment attributes to God, like the hearing of a prayer. Or like the Indians not knowing why the moon gets dark. This is what many liberal Protestants think about these matters. So modernists, too, will reject miracles in general. According to the other heterodox notion, which by contrast proceeds from agnosticism and contingentism, a miracle is not an abrogation of the laws of nature, but rather of our manner of conceiving of the laws of nature. You see, we think that there are laws of nature, but maybe we're wrong about them, such as the position held by a number of modernists. In both conceptions, miracles do not have an ontological value as divine seals, but instead only have a symbolic value for provoking the soul to examine religion as well as its conformity with our aspirations. See, so it excites us to think about our religious experience. These two notions, which seem opposed to each other, are ultimately reduced to naturalism, as we will explain in what follows. So here we get to the heterodox notion of miracles founded on determinism. Determinism holds that all things take place in a necessary manner in accord with the determinate laws of nature, so that God himself could not act contrary to such physical laws, just as he cannot act in a way which would be contrary to mathematical or metaphysical laws. We'll see why that's wrong. Hence, Baruch Spinoza, he was the famous Jew who was kicked out of Portugal and went to Holland, as they all know, and was kicked out of the synagogue in Holland because he was a heretic. He became the first modern pantheist, right? Who, after Descartes, wished to reduce physical laws to mathematical laws. Mathematicians tend to see all things through the eyes of math. Just as all surgeons want to fix everything with surgery, and all ordinary doctors, what you call primary doctors, want to fix everything with a pill. So, and all carpenters want to fix everything with a hammer. So, I mean, it's understandable. So he absolutely denied the possibility of miracles. Just as God cannot make a square circle, so too it is impossible for him to raise someone from the dead. All right, so it is true that God cannot act against his essence, and therefore he cannot do something which is intrinsically impossible, such as a square circle. And that does not detract from his omnipotence, but rather it affirms that he is supreme truth, that he is subsistent truth, because what is contrary to his essence is false, and impossible, intrinsically impossible. So, but physical laws are things that he created. They could be different, and he is able to intervene in those and suspend them, for example, that fire not burn, or various other things, being healed from a mortal disease, raising people from the dead. Those are physical laws that govern those things, and he created them. So he could adjust gravity as he would. Where you're heavy today and light tomorrow, that might make a lot of people feel good. Just as gravity is different on the various planets. On the moon, you're much lighter on the moon. Get on a scale on the moon, you're good. he could vary the atmosphere. He could all sorts of things. He could, I mean, just he has made life dependent upon oxygen, but he could have made it dependent upon some other gas. So all of those things are. Hence, Spinoza does not directly deny God's omnipotence, but instead his freedom. According to Spinoza, God acts ad extra, outside of himself, from a necessity of nature, and therefore always acts in the same way, like the vital principle in plants. See, so he was a pantheist, so God is not free. See, he's everything he does by necessity. This error was already set forth and refuted by St. Thomas in the De Potentia. The deists, does everyone know what a deist is? I think I've mentioned the deist. Okay. Did indeed admit the essential distinction between God and the world, but they said God only has his general acts of will, voluntates generales, that should be, by which the laws of the world were constituted, but not particular acts of will concerning singular things. So he's in Florida, and say he retired down to Florida. This is and you occasionally hear from him, but he's doesn't bother with human events. For this would be unworthy of divine providence. Hence, miracles are not possible. He doesn't care about what we do. See, such also was the position of the Averroists. Everyone know who Averroes was? No, he was one of the Muslim. He and Avicenna were two Muslim philosophers who did the wonderful thing of preserving Aristotle, but did the bad thing of misinterpreting him. And they were, again, pantheists. And St. Thomas, they made their way, their ideas made their way into the University of Paris when St. Thomas was there, and he blasted them. So he overcame their influence in the University of Paris. But they did preserve the works of Aristotle. Nicolas Malebranche, however, in order to resolve the objections raised by determinism, said in certain works of his, a miracle is an effect depending upon general laws which are not known by us. So, especially upon the general laws of the spiritual world by which the angels act in the sensible world. And Malebranche seemed to hold that most miracles could be explained in this way. However, according to him, there are other miracles, such as the incarnation, which exceed the powers of angels, and he seems to be speaking of these when he says in another place, miracles do not depend on general laws, but rather on God's particular will, and in this way they are distinguished from natural facts. So, all right. Leibniz, anyone know who Leibniz is? Yes? No? Leibniz, did we hear of Leibniz?
I've heard of it.
He was a German philosopher from the late 17th century, 1600s, and he was a rationalist. He's like Descartes. And however, he wanted to see the reunion of the Protestants and the Catholics. That's what, and he was very insistent upon that. And he also encouraged Louis XIV to conquer Egypt, which he didn't do, but Napoleon did. So I don't know what the attraction was to Egypt, but Leibniz was trying to. Louis XIV was like the Trump of his age. Oh, Trump needs one of those wigs and he'd be fine. So Leibniz, too, on account of his absolute optimism and the determinism of moral necessity, diminished the supernaturality of miracles. He says, if the changing of water into wine at Cana was a miracle of the first rank, exceeding all the powers of creatures, God would have thereby changed the entire course of the universe on account of the interconnection of bodies, or otherwise he would have needed even more miraculously to prevent this interconnection. it's really not worth our time. And then there's another Utavil. We're not worried about him either. If you go to the next page, 53, the liberal Protestants reject the traditional notion of miracles on account of the determinism that they hold exists in the laws of nature. Liberal Protestants are Schleiermacher and school. The modernists, everything's religious experience. And so for them, a miracle is an extraordinary natural event that has not yet been explained by science, an event that can be attributed to God by religious, and Sabatier are your people there. All right. So then he responds to these. Again, I don't think we have to go through the responses to these unless you need to one day. So that's why I say you should have. I doubt that you would have to. I never had to go through all this stuff with anybody in 50 years. So it's a long time. So go to the theological explanation of the Catholic notion of miracles. St. Thomas, properly speaking, a miracle takes place when something is done outside of the order of nature. However, it does not suffice for there to be a miracle if something is done outside the order of any given particular nature. Otherwise, anyone would perform a miracle by throwing a stone upwards. See, because by its nature, it wants to fall down to the earth. So I've done a miracle because the stone is now flying in the air. Therefore, in order for something to be called a miracle, it must be outside of the order of the whole created nature. And this is something that God alone can do, for whenever an angel or any other creature does by its own power is in accord with the order of created nature. So angels have a nature that is much higher than ours. And therefore, they are capable of many more things that we are not capable of. Thus, meaning that such an action is not miraculous. Hence, God alone can work miracles. There's the primum to the first objection. We must say that some angels are said to perform miracles either because God works miracles at their request, as when holy men are said to work miracles, or because such angels exercise some form of ministry in the miracles which take place, as in collecting the dust of the deceased in the general resurrection, or by performing other such actions. So the angels will have a lot to do at the general resurrection, but for example, most of the manifestations of God were considered to be done by angels. For example, the burning bush. Trying to think of other things that, particularly in the Old Testament, considered to be done by angels. All right. Therefore, going beyond the nominal definition to the real definition of miracles, strictly speaking, Catholic theologians say that a miracle is a fact produced by God in the world outside the order of action that belongs to the whole of created nature. It is called a fact and not, however, a doctrine. Nay, in order that it be a sign, it must be a sensible fact. So look at the footnote. Hence, merely spiritual miracles, like a vision had by a charismatic and other such extraordinary things, which are discussed in mystical theology, cannot be a direct testimony for others or a sign of immediate revelation. However, for the person who receives them, they can be immediate criteria of revelation, inasmuch as it is clear that such things certainly come to them from God. So people who have some form of locutions or some sort of direct contact from God, they would, if they are certain that those things come from God, would be bound to believe them, but they are not sensible signs for others. So that's why I think that Mary of Agreda is very dangerous, because it's all her, I mean, it purports to be her personal revelations from an angel, I think. And I mean, there's no guarantee, and there's rather reasons against it, especially that she says if you don't accept this, you know, you're sinful, which is a sure sign that something is deeply wrong. That's why Pius VI condemned it in the 1770s. So those things have to be taken with a certain reserve. In other words, this may not be true. You know, it could be the person's imagination, but it could be true too. But you know, certainly, I would say that particular book is, well, it was condemned. But there are others. You know, for example, the messages from the Virgin Mary. I mean, they certainly are not. They do not pertain to faith. I mean, it's in Fatima or Lourdes or other La Salette. They don't pertain to faith. They might pertain to faith for the persons that heard them, if they are certain of it. You see, but they so you could say I don't accept those, and that it may or may not be rash, may or may not, depending on your motives for not accepting it. So, produced by God, it is said to be in the world and not outside of the world. It is outside of the order of nature, but not outside the order of divine providence, for miracles depend upon God's ordinate power, guided by this wisdom, even though it is here exercised in an extraordinary way. So it's not extraordinary for God. Finally, it is said to be outside of the order of action that belongs to the whole of created nature, and not only outside of the order of acting belonging to some particular created nature, for otherwise the throwing of a stone into the air would be a miracle. It is said to be outside of the order of action, not of being, for the miraculous effect effectively exceeds all created powers, but does not tentatively exceed all created natures. That means it does not exceed the being of them. See, so, for example, only intrinsically supernatural grace, which is a kind of formal participation in the divine nature, exceeds the order of being of the whole of created nature. So it cannot jump the order of being. There's this supernatural being, this natural being, so it has to be within its own order. However, by contrast, bodily resurrection supernaturally bestows natural life upon a corpse, not supernatural life. See, so Lazarus came back to natural life and then died later, you know, but so it's not like the resurrection, the final resurrection. Thus, divine miracles are distinguished from natural facts, even extraordinary ones like fortuitous events, which are called fortuitous in relation to second causes and not in relation to providence, to which all things are subject. So there's no such thing really as chance or fortune. It's only a causa per accidens in the sense that we don't know the cause. But when you win the lottery, it's because the computer chose your numbers, right? And that's not by chance. Everything has a sufficient cause, everything. So there's some ratio in the computer that produced that number that day, but it's not by chance. The same thing is true if they picked it out of a big basket or something. There's causes whereby that number just happened to be in the place where your hand goes in. There are causes. An accident on the road, there are very, very evident causes of why two cars collide. And that's why they do accident reports. They want to know how this happened. But you call it an accident in the sense that it was something that should not have happened. Well, in fact, it should have happened because there are two people wanting to be in the same place at the same time. Airplane crashes, you know, they do. There's a sufficient cause for everything. So thus defined, miracles are distinguished, one, from natural facts, even extraordinary ones, like fortuitous events, which are called fortuitous in relation to second causes. Two, from diabolic marvels, which are mere simulacra or imitations of miracles. Three, from divine facts or effects that are ordinary, as are the conservation of things in being. See, creation and conservation in being is the same act for God. So for everything that exists, he has to will its preservation and being, even a pebble, an ant. He is conscious of all of those things, which is kind of mind-boggling. And he is maintaining them in existence. God's pre-motion in created things and activity. In other words, all of the motion of the universe is dependent upon him. Something like winding a clock, which people don't do anymore, but something like that. In other words, that God's pre-motion is in, just as the mainspring is operating all of the motion of the clock, and is in all of the various motions, so also God's pre-motion is in all motion that is in the universe. That doesn't exclude secondary causes, but there would be no motion without him. But you'll see that in De Deo Uno. The daily creation of spiritual souls and the justification of the wicked, which is not a miracle, but instead the end aimed at by miracles. So that would be the justification of the wicked, would be a properly supernatural act. Likewise, miracles are distinguished from ordinary facts that are called providential, inasmuch as providence is more clearly made manifest in them, for example, in accord with a favorable answer to a prayer. So the victory at Lepanto, which should have gone against the Catholics because of the rosaries that were said. Also the one before Vienna, when the Turks attacked Vienna. Sobieski, that was a big rosary campaign. So corollaries. First, nothing can be called a miracle in comparison to the divine power, for all actions are of little account in comparison to the divine power. However, something is said to be a miracle in comparison to the power of nature that it exceeds. Second, if a miracle ought to be sensible as a sign, it need not be limited to being performed outside of the laws of the physical order, but also can be outside the laws of the intellectual or moral order, as in the cases of prophecy, the gift of tongues, and St. Paul's miraculous conversion. So those are properly miracles. However, in order for it to be called a miracle and a sign, it must be at least manifested externally in some way, for otherwise it would not cause wonder. So you can imagine what they would have been Jewish soldiers in front of Damascus thinking, well, what happened? They didn't see anything. Just that he fell off his horse and he was a wreck. Blind. So Third, although properly speaking, a miracle exceeds all the powers of created nature, the term miracle is used improperly or in a broad sense for certain deeds that do not exceed the powers of angels, and that, in consideration of the circumstances surrounding them, are attributed to good angels or to God. For example, the fact that someone holy could walk upon the waters does not exceed all created powers. So, Saint Raymond of Penafore, he had the miracle of going from Italy to Spain and something like a surfboard. Or I'm not sure what it was, but it was something like that. Or it's something that would be outside of normal abilities, but not exceeding, strictly speaking, natural powers. And that could be done by an angel. Trying to think of other. Hence, someone like Simon the magician was able to be lifted into the air by some demonic power. So, the devil is capable of all of those things. The properties of miracles. A miracle is said to be arduous inasmuch as it exceeds the powers of nature. It's hard, it's difficult. 2, it is said to be outside of the hopes or exigencies of nature. For nature is only obedientially, not naturally ordered to it. See, that means nature will obey if it is uplifted to do something miraculous. It has the ability to obey. That's obedientially. Namely, inasmuch as it obeys God in order to receive whatever he may will. However, it is not above the hope of grace, which comes from faith through which we believe in the future resurrection. It is said to be not customary, for it does not frequently take place, but rather stands outside of the ordinary course of natural activity. So, if you had miracles every day, I went around raising people from the dead all over Reading or something like that, it would lose its miraculous effect. A miracle is not contrary to nature. It does not violate nature, whatever those who hold to naturalism might say. Rather, it accords with the obediential potency of nature. Obedience to God, the Creator. That fire not harm somebody, for example. Or that the boiling oil in the cauldron did not burn St. John the Evangelist. He's in charge of nature. He made it. He can do whatever he wants with it. So, namely, with its primary aptitude by which any given creature naturally obeys God in order to accept whatever he may will, as our arms obey our will. Our arm obeys our will. So, it's the same thing. There's you have a will, and your limbs obey what your will intends. Thus, a miracle is not contrary to the laws of nature. It is not a violation of the laws of nature, and indeed does not destroy them. Rather, it presupposes and confirms them as an exception confirms the rule. That's why they are miraculous. That's why they cause wonder. Rather, it's just, for example, the dead do not naturally rise again. It's very unusual. This law is so true that God alone can supernaturally raise the dead. Indeed, as we will discuss below, the laws of nature are hypothetically necessary, namely on the supposition. Hypothetically means on some condition or supposition, not absolutely. It's opposed to absolutely. Namely, on the supposition that all the various natural causes act in the appropriate conditions. Miracles are called signs because they manifest something supernatural, namely either the divine origin of a given doctrine or the holiness of some servant of God. All right. And then this is important, the division of miracles. This division is explained in St. Thomas. Something is called a miracle in comparison with the power of nature which it exceeds. Thus, the more the power of nature is exceeded, the greater is the miracle in question. Now, the power of nature is exceeded in three ways. First of all, it can be exceeded by the very substance of the deed in question, quantum ad substantiam facti, as happens, for example, in the case of two bodies occupying the same place, as when our Lord went through the walls after his resurrection, that of the sun reversing its course, or that of the glorification of a human body. These kinds of things are absolutely beyond the power of nature and thus hold the highest rank among the miracles. So these are called miracles of the first rank. Second, something exceeds the power of nature not in what is done, but rather in the subject of its activity, quantum ad subjectum in quo fit, as, for example, in the case of the raising of the dead, returning of sight to the blind, and other such things, for nature can give life, though not to the dead. Thus, such miracles are second in rank. Third, something exceeds nature's power in the manner, quantum ad modum, and order in which it is done, as when a man is immediately cured of a fever without undergoing treatment or the usual course of nature's healing processes, or when the air is suddenly condensed into rain by divine power without some natural cause. See, that's simply a manner, a supernatural manner in which something happens, but it doesn't exceed the very nature of the thing. As took place in the prayers of Samuel and Elias, that should be and these are the lowest kinds of miracles. However, each of these kinds has various degrees depending on the different ways in which the power of nature is exceeded. All right, and then he goes through a number of clarifications or so on that, but that's not extremely important. And I don't think we need to read B either. Article 2 on the possibility of miracles, the state of the question and its difficulty, demonstration of this possibility, resolution of objection. So this is against all of the naysayers. And I don't think we need to answer them. As again, I've never come across somebody that really needed this kind of information. So, so I think we're going to skip all this. But you know where it is if you need it. I doubt you. The determinists and all of those people we mentioned at the beginning. If you look on page 70, he sets down a principle in boldface there, and that is that, well, first look at page 66. First, a superior free cause upon which depends the application of hypothetically necessary laws without itself being confined to them can act outside of their order. So that means that the laws of nature are hypothetically necessary. That is, they are dependent on ultimately God's will, and he is a superior free cause, and he can do whatever he wants. So, which is, if you believe in God, I don't think anybody has to tell you that. To the order of action belonging to the whole of created nature is constituted by laws that are hypothetically, not absolutely necessary. And the difference, look at the difference. Hypothetical necessity is that which is drawn not from intrinsic causes, but rather from extrinsic causes, namely the efficient and final causes. Formal and material are intrinsic causes. right? Efficient and final are extrinsic causes. Now, the order of action belonging to the whole of created nature is constituted by laws drawn from the order of efficient causality. Therefore, it's extrinsic causes. And so they are not absolutely necessary. God, as the author of all being, can intervene and do whatever he wants with regard to that. So then, number 3, God is the omnipotent free cause upon whom depends the application of all hypothetically necessary laws, efficient causes, and he is not confined to them, obviously, because he's God. All right. I don't think we need to elaborate on that. You look on page 74, the end of miracles, the purpose of them. A proportionate end is required for the extraordinary intervention by God. Now the manifestation of the saving truth is a sufficient end for God to act outside of the order of nature. So he uses them in order to confirm truth. God cannot use a miracle or do a miracle in confirmation of error. That would be against his nature. And the corollary, no creature can perform miracles through its own proper power. However, in order to perform a miracle, God can make use of men and good angels as instruments. So, and there are many cases of that. Here's on page 76, whether an evil person can instrumentally perform miracles. As St. Thomas says, since the performing of miracles is a kind of divine testimony indicating the divine power and truth, if the power of performing miracles is given to demons, whose will is wholly turned to evil, God would stand in witness to their falsity, which is not suited to the divine goodness. Hence the demons can only simulate miracles through the alteration of bodies or through some sensual illusion brought about through the alteration of one's imagination. So he can, your imagination belongs to your physical nature, in other words, your corporeal nature. So he can operate on that. He can suggest images and so forth. Miracles can be performed in order to, in order to confirm the truth of preaching by anyone who preaches the true faith and calls upon Christ's name, which even the wicked do from time to time. See, so the question is whether it is a confirmation of truth or not whether the person doing it is wicked or not. See? However, miracles are always true witnesses to the purpose for which they are performed. Hence, wicked men who teach false doctrine never perform true miracles in confirmation of their teaching, although they may sometimes do so in praise of Christ's name which they invoke, and by the power of the sacraments which they administer. I wish you would give an example of that. We have thus, well, for example, Caiaphas prophesied concerning the death of Christ. That's Caiaphas was after the resurrection from the dead, after the resurrection of Lazarus. There was a prophecy there. Whether that was truly a miracle, I mean, because he said it's better that one man die instead of the whole race perishing, because he feared that the Romans, they had this idea that he would be perceived by the Romans as a Galilean rabble rouser and rebel, which Pilate completely ignored. He had no interest in that whatsoever. His interest was whether Christ was a king. Art thou a king? He was constantly after that, and then that he put the inscription up on top of the cross. And he was somehow obsessed with Christ's kingship. And the Jews were saying this and that, he made himself God, and he's, that's sort of, he did say, where are you from? When the Jews said, he said that he was God. He did say to Christ, where are you from? And I don't know, can't remember if our Lord answered him or not, but he was not convinced at all that he was a Galilean rebel. That was just not on his mind. So there must have been something about, he probably had heard things about Christ and was interested to talk to him. Probably so. But anyway, Caiaphas said, it's, and that's considered that may not have been, that may just have been a speculation on Caiaphas's part. And he certainly was not aware of how it would work against the Jews and in favor of the followers of Christ, the death of Christ. And in fact, it was the rejection of Christ that brought the Romans down upon the Jews. If they had accepted Christ, that would not have happened. That's ironic. So, all right. Oh, that's the end of it. All right, so then we'll pick it up. Tomorrow? Do we have it tomorrow? Yeah. So we're making pretty good progress here. But we won't go into all of these objections and all this fine print. It's not, we'll go up to discernibility of miracles. And even that is not. There's a lot of things we can skip here. So we're on page 75, and we have to get up to 605, 615. Oh, this is the index, about 600. But it gets a little easier and more interesting and not as abstract, because you're proving, you're going through the miracles of Christ, his prophecies, fulfillment of the prophecies, etc. It's rather interesting. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Subtuum praesidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostros deprecationis et despicias in necessitatibus, sed periculis cunctis libera nos semper, Virgo gloriosa et benedicta. Amen.